All right, we'll go ahead and get started. Good evening, everyone. I hope you are enjoying this beautiful spring weather wherever you are, and the last week before spring break, which means we are getting very, very close to the end of our semester. So what I have on the agenda for this evening is just want to have a question and answer session about the SWOT outlines, which are due this evening by 10:59 p.m. I have received, it looks like almost everybody's. I feel like there may be still a few outstanding. So just want to open the floor for any questions, and then we will go over the lecture and have some group discussion from this week's material. So feel free, anybody jump in if you have any questions about the SWOT outlines or anything else about the syllabus or Blackboard or anything like that. It's your time. You all feel good about your the progress that you're making on the SWOT assignment? All right, good. If you're typing, I can hear you, just FYI. Go ahead and please mute your Zoom. I did receive a couple, just wanted to make a note, I did receive a couple questions about the first quiz, and the rest of the quizzes will be posted soon. Just wanted to let you know that I'm kind of collecting those and working on those, and we'll get back to you on that if I have not answered your question already. And yeah, so I'll just give you all a couple more minutes, see if there's any other questions about the SWOT outline. All right, well, if there's no questions, we'll go ahead and move forward with the lecture. I am going to share my screen and pull this up. Okay. All right, so on the agenda, and we'll get to as much of this as we can, I wanted to have a discussion about organizational culture, fostering diversity, and being sensitive to inequalities. And if we have time, we'll get to a group exercise. I did want to touch base with you all, and I don't think I've had a chance yet to follow up with you about the leadership blogs. I hope that you all have been reading these and enjoying them every week. They are provided to you to give you just kind of a whole different lens for this material, because we are, the Brody text and some of the readings, they're very, very social work focused, and I think that leadership is a topic that really, it cuts across every single industry, and I think it's important to keep abreast of just some differing perspectives, and some of the blogs have some additional resources that you can look up, and there's a lot of leadership resources that are posted on Blackboard as well. There's a document that's listed by topic area, so if any of the subjects that we go over in the semester, you really want to dig deeper in, there's definitely a lot of information in that additional resources tab on Blackboard for you all to investigate, or feel free to email me. So this blog this week was selected for a very specific reason, and that is because one of the things that when we talk about organizational culture, I like to highlight is that culture is really a choice. A lot of people may experience culture, maybe you all have experienced an organization's culture as a something that you inherit, something that it's there, it's fixed, you walk in the door and, week after week, you kind of learn all these little, nuances and idiosyncratic things that sort of make up your organization. A lot of those may be formal, and a lot of them may be informal. You observe them through behavior, and any number of other places where you may get some data about culture. And I liked this blog because it really, I think, cut to the heart of that culture is really a choice, and that no matter what your role is in an organization, you can be a leader, and you are responsible for creating a culture. It can be the culture of your team. It can be the culture of your larger organization. You may be responsible for operationalizing, the values that come down from your executive leadership if you're in a supervisory or management position. So you kind of get the information from above, and you streamline it down to the folks that you're responsible for leading. There's a lot of different ways that this looks. And this particular blog focused on resilient leadership and this whole idea of being a resilient leader. And it outlined 5 facets of that this particular view that was somewhat supported by the Institutes of Medicine, which is a great organization, the IOM, if you haven't heard of it. And so I'm curious, if any of you have ever worked for someone who you would consider a resilient leader. So just open the floor for you all. What were some of those facets that the author of the blog talked about? What made a person a resilient leader? I'm making the assumption that you all read the blog and you can participate in the discussion. Yeah. Thank you, April. It's, there is kind of there's an art to, working for or to creating a resilient culture. And, a couple of the examples that they brought out, it's, one of them is simply just attitude. Having a, being focused on, optimism was one of the things that they talked about, and being honest, being transparent. Kind of who likes to be around a pessimist? Something as relatively simple as that is, when you create a culture of optimism, you can help people weather any kind of adversity that comes their way. If you're overwhelmed by the caseload, if you work for a service organization, and maybe there's staff turnover and everybody's has to kind of take on the role of overseeing a number of different cases that they didn't have the day before. Things like that can get really overwhelming. And if you've got a leader, a supervisor who shows optimism, that can really affect and help create help lessen the stress. Because with the leader's stress, all of that is felt by the folks who work for that person. Some of the other examples are just being able to make decisions, being decisive, not overthinking, not doing that procrastination thing where it's paralysis by analysis. Building relationships was another thing that they talked about with resilient leadership. I feel like there was 5. There's a few more. But I really encourage you all, if you haven't read it yet, please read it. It really is an opportunity for you to look at this material in a different way, and for you to consider, what would it take for you to become a resilient leader in your current role? I talked about how people have the responsibility for creating culture in the roles they are, and even as an intern, you can be responsible for for influencing a certain amount of that culture through things like, integrity, strong ethics, maintaining your social work values in a really evident way. So please go ahead and read that if you haven't, and we will just continue on our discussion. So, culture is something that is, can be defined in different ways, but for our purposes today, we will talk about culture being the way that staff perceive that there is a right way to do things in the organization. And I mentioned that some of those ways that we perceive that is through simply observed behavior. What is being modeled for us? Not everything is written in the policies and procedures manual when we step in the door. Sometimes we start a job and there isn't even, nobody hands us a policy and procedures manual. Maybe they might sit down and say, here, you write it. I know you just started, but this needs to be done. And it's kind of just, get thrown into the deep end, so to speak. We observe that, and and that perception piece is really critical too, because sometimes we perceive things that may or may not be true or may not be accurate. So I want you to keep that in mind as well. Shared values. In the last couple of weeks, we didn't get a chance to talk about these in person, but I hope that you all reviewed the slides of that combined lecture. But having shared expectations, shared values were really critical to creating kind of cohesion and again, those kind of shared expectations and about, what kind of behavior is expected. And having shared values gives an organization a sense of direction, so that staff kind of see, what they're supposed to do, and not just in their own role, but also in relation to the overall organization's role. Managers also serve as the primary shapers and communicators of organizational values. So again, folks in a management role have a really key opportunity for shaping an organization's culture, as I mentioned. And again, they do that a lot through modeling. So culture, talking about creating organizational culture, is an opportunity to also talk about diversity. You really can't have one without the other. Diversity is kind of a state of being in a way. It's just kind of, you are who you are when you walk into an organization, and, you can look at any kind of demographic, makeup of an organization. What do those statistics look like? How many minorities, work in this unit, how many men and women work in this unit, and things like that. But fostering diversity is something that takes real intention, and you can't do that without a conversation about culture and about organizational culture. And specifically, just to give you a framework here, almost half of the United States workforce consists of minorities, immigrants, and women. And in the human service field, effective managers must foster and nurture workforce diversity. And why do you think that as social workers, that is a key motivation for us? Why do you think, besides the fact that, we work for minorities and our field is very much dominated by women, as I'm sure many of you all have experienced. What are some other reasons why, as social workers, we would want to nurture diversity in our workforce? Y'all are quiet this evening. I know. Yes.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I was thinking it would make the environment healthier, really, so that, more people are represented and not everyone's the same.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Healthier. Good. What are some other reasons?
It can bring in a different point of view, outside resources, a new way of thinking that, the majority might not even have considered.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yes, absolutely. There's a note here online about, increases competitiveness and really, when you have, diversity of perspective, diversity of ideas. You know, that old adage we've all heard since we were little, that two heads are better than one. You know, having outside perspective can really help us find fresh solutions to entrenched problems. I mean, many of the problems that social workers are designed to address are really entrenched. Things like institutional racism, discrimination, prejudice, stigma. These things have been around for a long time. They may, you know, hop from subpopulation to subpopulation, but, you know, they've been around a long time. And by fostering and nurturing diversity, you know, within and across our workforce, we can really increase the opportunity to find some new solutions to some old problems. Absolutely, Etta, promoting diversity is in the code of ethics. Definitely applies to all levels of social work. Yeah, and Stephen, you bring up a good point about kind of client matching. You know, how if we are a workforce that is predominantly female, you know, some agencies may serve clients that are predominantly male. So then, you know, what do you do there? Or, and, you know, and how does that relate to things like working with the LGBT population, or working with, you know, racial minority populations? And that's one of the hardest things to address. I've worked with a number of agencies that continually struggle for that. Sometimes there's issues with diversity even in education. You know, just having folks from different backgrounds. It's just either, you know, kind of all or nothing. So even things like that can be a challenge in certain areas, especially in rural areas. Right, Robert. Excellent example. So in New York, there's only 3 males in the state involved in social work. Wow, that seems really disproportionate. But it brings up a good point. It's hard, and that's kind of can be a real systemic issue for us to look at, even on the university side, on the education side. You know, who's applying to our program? You know, we don't have really control over that. But you know, how are we as a field, as a profession, how are we motivating diversity in our workforce? Oh, did I say anything? So, you know, there's a lot of reasons. So one of the things I was also wondering, you know, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which was passed many, many years ago at this point, prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, and religion. And this is a federal law. There are other federal laws that speak to discrimination. I'm just kind of putting this one out there for discussion. And there are going to be different policies around discrimination based on the organization that you work for and the state. So you may have a state law that is broader than this particular law, and an organizational policy about discrimination that's even broader than the state and federal laws. And so I'm curious to hear from you all. What do you think is missing from this list that you may have seen in policies, anti-discrimination policies that you have worked under, either currently or previously? Do you see anything that as social workers we would be concerned about that's not on this list? Yeah. Gender identity, sexual orientation. Yeah, good. What else? Age, absolutely, Etta. Absolutely. Age is a big one. What else?
I have a question.
Sure.
How do you feel about race identity?
What do you mean by that?
Well, I can't think of her name, but there's a lady in the news who was the president of the NAACP, and she identifies as African American, and she is having a hard time being accepted, and she's about to be homeless. And I'm not sure people really take her seriously because she's got a racial identity problem. But to me, it's as serious as someone who's probably struggling with gender identity. Not to offend anyone, and I'm kind of ignorant towards all of it, but when I listen to her speak and I listen to other people speak about their struggles with gender identity, I haven't really heard anyone speak about racial identity.
That's a really good question. the only conversation, and I don't necessarily feel when, when your question was like, how do I feel? All I can do is kind of present information to you. I haven't heard, I think I do know, I think I have, that story is sounding vaguely familiar. There was kind of, there was a pretty big scandal, if I remember correctly, about this this woman who had a significant role at the NAACP, and then she identified as African American, but then I guess it came out that she kind of technically wasn't, and so it kind of, she was, I think, asked to resign, or she's no longer there. Is that the story that you're talking about?
Yes.
Okay. I haven't heard of any, just personally, just in the news or anything, I haven't really heard that that's really, I just personally haven't heard if that's an issue. Where I have heard that it's an issue is when you have someone who is, biracial or multiracial, and where identity issues kind of present as just, I don't know if confusion is the right word, but just something, it just presents as an issue because they're multiple, they have multiple identities that they're kind of merging into one person. And so I've heard of racial identity in those terms, but not in a, I was born one way and but I feel a different way. I haven't really heard about it. I haven't really heard any kind of discourse or seen any sort of research about that particular issue. Has anybody else on the meeting? I'm sorry I can't be more helpful to you in that. It's just not something that's in my, it does sound interesting.
Oh, no, it's fine. And I wasn't, it's something that's new. And I know as people get braver and feel more comfortable with expressing how they truly feel, I just wasn't sure if anybody had heard any other cases. And I'm thinking this might not be the end of it because, we're very supportive now with gender identity, and I just don't know if this will give more people the courage to come forward if they are struggling personally with some type of racial identity.
I think you bring up a really good point, and I think as social workers, any kind of group that is underrepresented or is minority or any way, or is experiencing prejudice or stigma or discrimination in any way, we're definitely going to care about that. So I thank you for bringing that to our awareness, and I think it's something that we can all kind of keep an eye out for, because certainly 10 years ago, there was not a national conversation about gender identity the way that there is now. Even 5 years ago, there wasn't a conversation about gender identity the way that there is now. So you're right, these things can kind of progress pretty quickly. So one of the other things that I wanted to point out, and this kind of goes back to the blog for this week as well, is that one of the things that all 5 of those kind of characteristics of a resilient leader had in common is that they were all process oriented. They were not quick fixes. They were not, flash in the pan, one-time deals. They were all something that really was a process, something that you worked towards, something that was much more of a journey that you had to emphasize and reemphasize and build your skills around and practice. And fostering diversity is very much the same way. It's not a single program for preventing discrimination. It's a process for developing an environment that works for all employees. So there is something to be considered when you think about fostering diversity is, what is your intention around this as an organization? These things, having an open culture, having an organizational culture that fosters diversity, does not just spontaneously generate. It's something, there may be pieces of it that are organic, but it's something that leadership, that management, that frontline staff are going to have to work at on a daily basis and be very, very intentional about. Part of it does involve a holistic approach for creating an environment that's cooperative, that where people feel, can reach their full potential, work together to achieve organizational objectives, and kind of like what many of you all were saying, where all sides and all perspectives can be considered and can really add to the, kind of like the, the total is greater, the sum is greater than the individual parts. So this is something that takes a lot of intention to accomplish. So a couple things I wanted to highlight around some potential strategies that you all can use in your current placements and your future placements. And a lot of this may be kind of dependent on being in a management role or things like that. But it's also, and I would love to hear some of your additional ideas. This list is certainly not exhaustive. So one thing is, we can't address what we don't know. And so establishing a baseline about simply, how many minorities do you have in your organization? What is the diversity of your organization is a critical first step that you can kind of start and then measure your progress moving forward. So if you want to set goals, you kind of need a baseline first, or you do need a baseline first. You can establish guidelines and goals to help managers promote minorities and women that are, competent and effective in their positions. You can develop policies to increase the gender diversity of the workforce. Again, for social work, that's something that's going to continue to be a challenge just simply because of the numbers. So, how do you address that? And how do you address that legally as well? Since you as a hiring agency are, prohibited from, discriminating as well. So it's one of those things that remains a challenge for organizations. You can do things like establish a diversity awareness team headed by senior staff to encourage progress for talented minorities and women. Some other ideas, focusing on building relationships, break down some of the stigma, break down some of the barriers by, celebrating the diverse makeup of your organization, whether that's for religious reasons, ethnic differences, racial, gender, whatever that diversity may be, celebrate it, promote it. You can also create a new paradigm that emphasizes a learning perspective and encourage people to bring fresh ideas. A couple of you mentioned that earlier around, how diversity does encourage things like competition, encourages new ideas to bring to the fore. Another thing that's important for fostering diversity is simply and challengingly sometimes is being honest and being, having the humility to listen to feedback. And, when you encourage management staff, frontline staff, executive staff to examine their assumptions and expectations regarding minority groups, that takes real honesty. It takes courage sometimes. But it also can be a really effective way of putting the issues on the table that really matter. If you have, underlying stigma or somehow are participating in some level of institutional racism that's maybe just so entrenched that you don't even see it, it's really hard to do that without, examining what's really going on, which is, again, another reason why you can't address issues of diversity without also looking at issues of organizational culture. You can't have a culture that says, tell us what you really think and be honest with us, and then that just ignores that feedback. Why would people be honest with you? Or that comes back and, twists it around and, there's some kind of, negative consequence for your honesty. You can't do that and work on some of these tough issues. I mentioned attitude. They talked about optimism in the blog, but, conducting regular attitude surveys of the entire organization can help you determine, what ways, women or minorities or other, subgroups that you work with experience prejudicial attitudes. I mean, simply asking the question is a really good first step as well, and could potentially be integrated into your baseline assessment for just kind of figuring out, where is your organization on this. And one last slide on this, just for some strategies, is you can establish a core group of people to lead, and sometimes you can even get outside people if your organization can afford it, to facilitate a informal discussion and self-improvement, and encourage staff to candidly express experience with prejudice within the organization. Again, it's one of those things that you can't really address something that you don't know about, so you have to create safe spaces for people to feel comfortable to be candid, to be honest. And sometimes having an outside person, a skilled facilitator, can help do that, especially when it's truly a transparent process. It's supported by management. It's supported by executives, and there's a whole kind of 360 view, and everybody who participates in the process understands what's going to happen with that information, and that whole process is very transparent. I had this class this morning for the folks in Nashville, and there was a student there who had actually participated at her last job in a process that looked almost exactly like this, in an effort to address diversity issues within their organization. So it is something that folks are out there actually doing. And lastly, you can do things like assign a mentor to promising persons who may be underrepresented in upper level positions, and to help them move up the organizational ladder. You definitely need to kind of walk a fine line with this, because you don't want to be seen as having, going back to the organizational culture piece, you don't want to get into the issue of preferential treatment and things like that. But sometimes people just it makes sense to provide some additional level of support or mentoring in certain areas that can be very, very effective to help do things like prevent turnover, and help identify and address issues of prejudice and discrimination before they take root. So before I move on to inequalities, do you all have any questions about fostering diversity or the importance of it? Do you all see the connection between organizational culture and fostering diversity, and why we talk about these things together? All right, well, if there are no questions, I'll jump to our last topic about being sensitive to inequalities. And this is something that can look many, many different ways, and but is very integral to creating a healthy organizational culture and climate for all of your employees. And one of the things to kind of jump off here is to think about, something that, especially with social workers, is very inherent to everything that we do, is our idealism. In the human service field, we are very driven to, help other humans. That's why we get into this work. It's typically, not for the money. We want to, be the change that we want to see in the world. We want to affect change with one person, or we want to affect change on a larger, macro level at the organizational or state or national or international level. And we're very driven by that. So when we are participating, when we work for or with an organization that we perceive to be going against those values that drive our work, so our social work code of ethics, for example, it's very near and dear to our hearts, obviously, and everything that we do. And so if we work for an organization where that management runs counter to that, we see people behaving in a way that don't meet our expectations, that doesn't align with our professional values, staff can become really deflated, potentially hostile even, definitely can create low morale, high turnover. When things don't, we think they're one way or we expect them to be one way and they wind up being another, it can really create distrust of the organization that we work for. Why would we want to work for people in an organization that we didn't trust? So we may just, hopefully the grass will be greener over here, try out a different organization or a different supervisor if possible. So those things can become it's just important for us to kind of keep this at the front of our minds. So when we do sense some level of injustice, it can be perceived, there's that word again, it can be perceived or it can be real. And staff who think they are operating under inequitable conditions have an increased disaffection and even distrust of the organization, as I mentioned. And this whole idea of perception is really important because perception is reality, whether it's actually true or not. So being sensitive to how our employees, how our staff, how our clients and our consumers of our services, how they perceive our behavior is really, really important. So it's important to have those kind of 360 feedback loops and have the courage to have open and honest conversations with people about, how things are really received. We can have the best intentions in the world, but they may fall flat if they're not supported by behavior that's in alignment with those intentions. Some examples of things that can kind of go haywire in this area. I'm sure that many of you have experienced some of these things, like inappropriately favoring some staff over others, providing, having prerequisites that apply to, certain people and don't apply to others, or certain positions don't apply to others, where it's not appropriate. Treating staff unfairly, inappropriately discriminating, using agency time to conduct personal business, exploiting staff. These things may not be intentional, but they certainly can be perceived as some level of, exploitation of staff, requiring certain people work overtime and other people don't. Things like salary is a big deal here. We all I think it's a joke that people don't know what other people make. Certainly if you work for the state of Tennessee, you can just look it up. There's a whole website. You can find any state of Tennessee employees' salary. Things like when you understand that somebody who has less experience and less education makes more money than you do, you're definitely going to have a perception of, unfair treatment, unjust treatment. And in that case, it potentially is real. So either way, staff can perceive that the organization is operating with diminished integrity, and this affects their own attitudes and professional performance. And anything that's going to affect professional performance matters to leaders and management, absolutely. And because staff are acutely aware of possible injustices, effective managers must be sensitive to staff's perceptions of unequal treatment while doing all they can to prevent inequitable decision making. So essentially, that's saying, be sensitive even when it's a perception. You may say, I'm treating you fairly, but if there's a perception that that somebody's not being treated fairly, it's valid and it needs to be addressed, in an appropriate manner. It can't just be ignored. If it's ignored, it's gonna foster distrust. It's gonna foster, low morale, all kinds of those things. So again, remember this whole idea of the importance of perception when you're looking at some of these issues. So I do want to see, so I think we do have a little bit of time. So I would love to hear from you all. Some examples of any of these organizational cultures or issues of diversity that you've seen within your organization or your team. So let's just kind of start with the first one. Can any of you share any examples of when you experienced support for diversity within an organization, or even a specific, kind of team or operational unit within your organization?
Can you ask for that example again? I got confused on what exactly. Sorry.
Yeah. So, we've been talking about, creating an organizational culture. And like I mentioned kind of at the beginning, a lot of times culture is, it's there for you when you walk in the door, when you first walk in the door. And I am curious if any of you have worked for an agency that you really feel like did a first-rate job of promoting and fostering diversity, where you worked. So, and that can look any number of ways, and I'm sure may even look different in different parts of the country as well, whatever is kind of culturally relevant for that area. And diversity can mean some of the examples that we talked about with like age and race. One thing we didn't mention was like socioeconomic status, disability. We mentioned sexual orientation, gender identity, but anything, that you could have witnessed where your agency was really saying, having diversity among our staff is really important. And, we want to do, these specific things to, make sure that we really engender that.
I can give an example. So currently I work at Vanderbilt, and I work with Huntington's disease patients. And a Huntington's disease patient can mimic many different things. A big one is they can appear to be drunk, or they can appear to be using drugs. So they actually, and we have clinic once a month, and there's all types of disciplines involved. It's not just the doctors, it's speech therapists, it's research teams, it's, nurses, it's just a big combination of different people. And so the clinics will start at 9, and every clinic, before the clinic, it's almost like a powwow, and they specifically go through each patient and point out their difficulties, because they don't want you to have any preconceived notions. And it's really, having the competency by having an awareness of this disability. And they do that every single month. And I think that that's amazing, because, like I said, Huntington's disease presents itself in many different forms. So that just came to mind when your question was proposed.
Yeah. So it's something that you have to be, intentional about having conversations about. So good.
Yes.
Are there any other examples that you all would like to share?
I have one. The agency I work at does a few different kinds of services, and while social work students and another employee see the clients that come in, they come in for food or for emergency rent and utility services. The kind of more behind the scenes stuff are like running the food pantry, and there's a thrift store attached to it, and recovering the food that goes to the food pantry, and a whole bunch of behind the scenes stuff is done through a bunch of different volunteers. And she gets the volunteers in a bunch of different places. So some AmeriCorps positions have opened up for community members. It's called light duty workers. So they got hurt at work, but they maybe can't do what their original job was while they're getting better, but they can do some work. So they get paid through their work, but they come to us. So that's a range of different people. There's a program to pay seniors. So officially they're volunteering for us, but they're getting paid a little bit to do that, not through the agency. And just, there's a whole wealth of people. The organization's been open for like 30, 40 years. And so it's built a great community support, and there's a bunch of different challenges that go with all of the people that are there, but the director kind of just handles them as they come along, and really stresses that all of these people, all these different types of people are very important to the agency, and that she needs them all. And if there's an individual problem, she tries the best that she can to work it out however's best, to make sure everybody can continue to get along smoothly. And it actually goes pretty well, and it works really well for the agency. And it's a very interesting climate, because you never know who's exactly going to be there and what exactly is going on. And it's very different and very exciting. I like it a lot.
Thank you for that. That sounds interesting. And I think it also highlights what we talked about earlier around having those shared values, because it sounds like, it's not even the people that's driving it, because people change, they naturally kind of turn over. That's part of it. It's really the value of, that's really kind of driving that, and making it work, because everybody, no matter where they come from, is, feels like they're there, they have a purpose, and that, it's, that diversity is actually, creating something better than if it wasn't there to begin with. Are there any examples that you all can share of, just reading your Stephen. Yeah. There's so many different examples of this, and I'm interested also if you have some things that you can share where you feel like your organization was really, had a lack of support for diversity, which is, diversity was needed. And man, they just really they didn't step up to the plate, and they really, agency administrators really didn't do much to promote or support that diversity. Can you all think of any examples that you've experienced like that?
I actually have an example.
Great.
Okay, so the agency where I'm interning, I was actually in a situation where I sat in on a session by one of the providers who was meeting with an interracial couple. Can you hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, there's a lot of feedback. It's a little
Okay.
hard to hear you. Yeah.
So the provider was conducting a session, a marital session with an interracial couple.
Okay.
And the provider's Caucasian. And the session was obviously very heated. And I was observing, and I noticed that, I'm not going to say she wasn't racist, but I definitely think that there was some, maybe some cultural incompetence on her part towards the African American client. So in the middle of the session, she asked the client, African American client, to leave. And the client stormed out. And I'm African American. So I went after the client, just to kind of diffuse the situation. And just, I felt like it was an inappropriate way to handle the thing, to handle the session. You don't tell a client who's distressed to just get out of the meeting. So anyway, when I returned back and I was processing, with the provider later, she made a comment to me and said, is this how Black people react? Like, is this how they act when they get angry? So I was offended by it. And I felt like, she would speak to me and ask me this type of questions, and she behaved like this in front of an intern. What is she doing with the clients when no one is looking? So it was actually my first week there, and I didn't want to step on any toes, but I felt like the situation needed to be addressed. So I did bring it up to the director, and I don't think they handled it appropriately. I don't think they spoke to the provider, and it definitely was an example for me of what not to do ever.
Well, thank you for that. And just on behalf of everyone, I'm really sorry that you are at an agency where that's going on. And just as a side note, since you brought up something that's kind of, actively going on, I definitely encourage you, if you haven't already, and I'm not asking you to kind of talk about this anymore or anything, but just as a side note, I encourage you to talk to your field liaison. And if you can't get in touch with them for whatever reason, talk to your field coordinator here. Can help you kind of, just process that a little more and to see, because especially if you feel like it's something that's going, because obviously that any kind of lack of cultural competence in any way is kind of goes against our code of ethics, and is going to be not necessarily a placement that we would like to be in. So just as a side, I would encourage you to talk to your field support about that issue, just to kind of dive into it a little deeper, if that's something that you want to do. I think you bring up a great example, and it's kind of why I had this up here about the lack of support, is because this is, some examples of what not to do in a situation. And it really goes back to a couple of slides ago, where there was one of the ways to foster diversity was to simply ask people to be honest about their preconceived notions, about their some inherent prejudices which they may not even be aware of. So what are some of those assumptions that we make about certain populations of people, frankly, based on phenotype, just how the way they look, we make all kinds of assumptions about people. So it's important to be honest about that, to really, put that on the table, and that's the only way to really address it. And I also encourage you and support the fact that you actually brought that up to your director there at the organization. That sounds like it was definitely the right thing to do. I really appreciate you sharing that, and also having the courage, even though you had just started, to really address it. I think that sounds like it was really appropriate for you to do. All right, so switching gears a little bit, we talked about, how having shared values can really promote a healthy organizational culture and climate, and can help to foster diversity. So a couple days ago, I posted a list of questions in support of y'all completing your SWOT outlines around certain questions you could ask of your group. And so kind of what are your values as a group, as a team, was one of those. And I would love to hear some of what you all came up with, if any of the groups have had a chance to talk about those together and come up with any shared values that are going to be specific to your SWOT project, to your SWOT team. No volunteers? Well, if you haven't met as a, go ahead. Was somebody going to say something? Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry. I was just gonna mention that although my group and I don't think we had that specific conversation as far as how our strengths will contribute to this project, but I did notice that there was a significant trend for relationship building strength in our team.
Mm-hmm.
I think obviously we were looking to be well balanced throughout all the domains, but relationship building was definitely a significant one, and that's probably appropriate given the field that we're in.
Yes, yeah, definitely a trend.
Yes,
sure.
Just an observation. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I always assumed that marketing students were really good or had higher influencing strengths in the influencing domain, but I don't have any data to back that up. But social workers absolutely do tend to, in my experience with all my students that I have worked with on this, there are more folks in relationship building. And I think that's an opportunity for your team to look at that, and for all of you to figure out, what are those values that you all want to go by, honesty, respect, transparency, good communication, whatever that is. That's part of creating a team culture, is having things that you share, shared expectations, shared values, can really help to drive. And I'm very curious, and very much encourage you all to do that on the front end. I mean, I know we're really kind of halfway through at this point, but you still have quite a bit of work to do, and quite a few weeks yet before you do your presentations. And so you still have ample opportunity to have these conversations. And I'm curious to see that when you do have these conversations, and specifically answering those questions on the front end, that a lot of them are, logistics, but they're really, it goes back to that process piece that I talked about, being intentional and creating a culture for your team that will carry you throughout the whole project, and hopefully help you avoid some pitfalls, or help you address things in a better way than had you not kind of established some ground rules, so to speak. And if you have not done that in past group projects or in past kind of team experiences at your internship or your work, I'm curious to see if you all can reflect on those when you submit your group evaluation statements at the end of the project, and can kind of reflect on, we did this time for this project, and this is how it went. And, in past experiences, it went this way. So I'd be curious to see what kind of impact that had for just the whole group process for you. So I think we'll go ahead and close it up here in the next few minutes. But just to think about moving forward, again, culture is a choice. It's something that you can do intentionally. It's something that you do have the power to control to a great degree, because part of how you do it is through modeling your behavior, and you do have control. We all have control over our behavior. But in addition to that, there are, specific strategies depending on your responsibilities and your position within an organization. There are things that you can do to promote an organizational culture that is inclusive, that prioritizes cultural competence, respects diversity, and that is sensitive to the inequalities and perceptions of injustice that we talked about on the previous slide. So before we go, are there any examples that you all can think of, either that you've seen before or that you think that you can do in your current role or a future role to that maybe we haven't talked about yet, that you can do to address some of these issues and really work to prevent prejudice and to foster diversity within your organization? Are there any ideas? Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I'll just say I haven't done it necessarily within my organization or even my team, but I find myself a lot lately, actually myself and my husband, kind of challenging our friends, way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, recently we were out in public and there was a man that came into the establishment in a dress and high heels, and everybody was like, kind of freaking out. But it's like, what? He was brave enough to come out like that. He, is comfortable with who he is. What's the problem? Was he in the bathroom? I got to go pee, but I don't want to go. What? He's not going to bite you, So just, challenging people's, viewpoints and ideas, of different situations, not just that, but just in general. I found myself kind of challenging people and their ways of thinking, about, LGBTQ people and race and, all of the above. So I haven't necessarily had to do it in my agency, although I did have a situation where a fellow intern, a counseling intern, mentioned something about a client's name, the way it was spelled, and said, well, they, meaning African American people, well, they just throw any kind of letters together and make it up, and I'm like, no, this is the name, this is how you say it, and they just kind of looked at me like, oh, okay.
Oh, thank you for bringing up those examples, Terry. I think what you just said is perhaps most important, for this conversation in total, because all of this, to one degree or another, really does start at home. I love the idea that you are practicing this with your family, with your friends, and I assume I would believe that through that practice that you're starting at home, you're starting with self, that it's going to be easier for you to have those conversations in an organizational setting like you did with your fellow intern. I mean, right, you just kind of addressed it, right on, and then moved on. And that's a great example of how what we practice, kind of practicing what we preach, right, and how we can practice things outside of work and, have them apply and kind of create some more facility with some, hard to, kind of hard to talk about topics. Oh, wow. Thank you, Casey. Yeah, there's, it can be challenging to work with folks from different backgrounds, from different times. You're talking about, massive generational differances, even with the survivors of the Holocaust. And, that can be a real intense example. Yeah. Major generational differences that we have to deal with too. That's kind of a factor of diversity of age as well. And it really does translate. Age definitely translates to diversity of experience, obviously, too. Great. So are there any other examples? Y'all come up with shared some really good ones this evening. Are there any other examples that you can think of things that you can kind of concretely do to help put into practice some of the concepts we talked about today? All right. Well, we will, if there's no more comments or questions, we'll go ahead and close the session for this evening, but I do want to encourage you all to continue to email me as you have questions. I will review all of your SWOT outlines. Again, those are, they're not graded or anything. They are just a bit of just a check-in with your group to make sure things are moving smoothly, not slowly, they're moving smoothly, and that you can, get your questions answered in a timely manner, and I can provide any kind of additional support with you and make sure that I get that schedule of presentations completed. And once I finalize the presentation schedule, I will go ahead and put it up online. If I have two groups that kind of wanted the same time slot, I will probably just email you back and try to handle it that way. But other than that, I'll post all that online, so you can always just refer to that and just remember when your presentation time is. All right. So if there's no other questions or comments, it's 7 o'clock, and I hope you all have a great rest of the evening, and I look forward to talking to you again in April. Good night.